So my kids and I just got back from an adventure together. And if you have seen my previous 2 videos, then you know that I am talking about the book Adventuring Together by Greta Eskridge. And I read this book at the beginning of this year, and I was challenged to go on an adventure with my children every month. And I'll tell you what, we just got back from an incredible adventure. And this was an adventure to the Ecuador jungles. And it was epic. We encountered tropical storms, we encountered love and adventure and heartbreak. We laughed together, we wept together, and we went on this adventure through this book, Jim Elliot, One Great Purpose. And you know what? It was not the adventure that I thought we were going to go on this month, and yet it's the adventure that happened. And I want to talk to you today about reading aloud with our kids. Welcome to Born for Homeschool. If you're new here, my name is Rachel Bourne, and I hope you subscribe to Born for Homeschool as we share tips and tricks, information, and encouragement to support you in your homeschool. But I think we might need to clarify, what is our mission for homeschooling? Why are we even doing what we're doing? So in my video where I share my 2022 homeschool planning, how to even start, I'll put a link in the description box below if you want to check out that video. But I share with you in that video how I write my mission and my goals for our homeschool. And I share with you what my mission and goals are for this year for homeschooling. But the thing that I didn't clarify in that video was my husband and I had this overarching goal for homeschooling. And we want to prepare our children for what lies ahead for them. And we want to nurture their dreams and give them every advantage that we can to help them to grow to be the people, the individual, the child that God wants them to be, that God's created them to be. And so that's our whole goal in homeschooling. And so I have been diving deep the last several weeks into reading aloud to our children. So as I look at our goal for all of homeschool, for our family, for my kids, the things that I want them to know and to learn, and who I want them to be before they leave home. All this research that I've been doing over the last several weeks in regards to reading aloud to our children, I'll tell you, has dramatically transformed the way that I think about reading aloud. And so I don't think that I've been so profoundly challenged and encouraged as I have been the last several weeks as I've looked at the research behind reading aloud to your children. So today I'm going to share with you a lot of the things that I've learned, the things that I've been thinking about and mulling over the last several weeks, and just the impact that it's had on me and how I think it's going to change our homeschool. So first off, let's talk about the 5 benefits that I've been digging into when looking at reading aloud to your children and the importance of reading aloud to your children. So I'm going to look at what reading aloud does to your child's brain and what it does to their physical and physiological being, their person, their emotional well-being. And then I'm going to talk about how it increases their vocabulary and introduces them to sophisticated language patterns, and it gives them a greater ability to make connections, and that's like the reading comprehension part of reading. And then the 4th benefit, which is how reading aloud nurtures empathy and compassion. And then also the 5th thing is how reading aloud creates this bond, this connection between the reader and the listener. So let's dive in. So as I was doing all of my research for today's video, there were several things that I found, papers, reports, the American Association of Pediatrics reports, and all sorts of things that kept circling back around to several things. And some of the things that were intertwined and closely related was Sarah Mackenzie and her website, thereadaloudrevival.com, and her podcast, the Read Aloud Revival Podcast. And she's the author of this book, The Read Aloud Family. And then also, you will find circled and intertwined in all of this, this book, The Enchanted Hour, written by Megan Cox-Gurdon. And I'll talk more about this book, and I'll be reading some excerpts from this. Also was introduced, and in via podcast and through this book, you'll be introduced to Dr. John Hutton, who works at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and so you'll hear about a bunch of his research. And then also, I will be reading some excerpts from the Read Aloud Handbook, written by Jim Trelease. And as I've done all of this research, and it's really had an impact on me as a teacher and as a homeschooler, I've actually ordered, there are several updated versions of the Read Aloud Handbook by Jim Trelease. So I just ordered that, the updated version of that, and then I also ordered the new revised edition of Honey for a Child's Heart by Gladys Hunt. And that book was the book that probably the very first homeschooling book that I ever read. And so I want to have it in my personal library. So today let's dive in and talk about just 5 of the benefits for reading aloud with your child. And the very first one that I want to talk about is how it builds your child's brain. In the Read Aloud Revival podcast, number 173, Sarah Mackenzie, the author of this book, she interviews a Dr. John Hutton, and he is of the Reading and Literary Center at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And he says in this interview, a lot of what we're doing at Cincinnati Children's, which is really a great place to do this work, is using really, really fancy high-tech methods to verify the obvious. A lot of the stuff that we're doing using MRI, big, fancy, expensive machines, is really just to make the case that whatever grandparents so many teachers and parents already know, which is reading to kids as young as possible, as often as possible, is really good for them, and to really help shape their brains to not only learn to read, but to love reading, and to go on and to have wonderful imaginations and success in school and life. So he just lays it out there. This is what reading aloud does. It gives them all these things. It helps to shape their brains, not only to learn to read, but to learn to love reading, to go on to it helps shape their brains to have good imaginations. And those are the building blocks for success in school and in life. And also, in The Enchanted Hour, I want to read what Megan Gurdon writes. She said she had a meeting with Dr. Hutton where she went and met with him, and he was showing her some of the research that he and his team had done. So she writes here, he slid his finger over the second column in the chart, the one showing neural activation as children looked at pictures while listening to a story. So, listening to a story, looking at the pictures, a picture book. Bam, he said. All these networks are really firing and connecting with one another. You didn't need a medical degree to see meaning in the serried stacks of bright red boxes. When the children were listening to the story, while looking at pictures, their brain networks were helping each other, reinforcing neural connections and strengthening their intellectual architecture. That's amazing that they are able to look at these MRI results and see what exactly is happening. Good things, amazing things, as these neurons are firing together and helping the brain develop. So the first thing reading aloud does is it gets your child's brain activated and firing and making all these connections that it needs to develop properly. So the second benefit of reading aloud to your child is it nurtures your child's actual physiological body and their emotional well-being. In The Enchanted Hour, Megan Gurdon writes about this. She writes about all reading together, all of her children gathered around with her, and her husband, just home from work, stretched out on the floor in his suit. It was a golden moment, she writes. None of us knew it at the time, but we were partaking of what clinical psychologist Hilary Cash calls, quote, a whole bouquet of neurochemicals, unquote. Human beings produce this bouquet when we're physically close to people we love, and its effect is to help us stay emotionally and physiologically regulated. We are social animals, after all, not just creatures of social media. Being in affectionate company feels good for us. Susan Pinker prefers a stronger metaphor than bouquet. She told me, quote, a tsunami of neurochemical benefits gets unleashed when a parent and child cuddle together over a book. Stress and anxiety downshift for starters. As soon as the parent puts his or her arms around the child, hormones flood their bloodstreams, relaxing them and engendering mutual trust, end quote. So there is an actual physiological response when your child sits in your lap, you put your arms around them, and you open up a book together. And it's an important response that your child needs to help them learn to self-regulate, to learn all of these important things. They need those chemicals in their bodies to help them regulate their anxiety. And it's just a wonderful experience. I love that doctors can prove what is happening in your child's body as you read aloud to them. So benefit number 3 to reading aloud to your child is it increases vocabulary and introduces sophisticated language patterns and gives a greater ability to make connections. So like the reading comprehension part of reading. So in his book, The Read Aloud Handbook, Jim Trelease writes, when you take time to read to your class, you are not neglecting the curriculum. Reading is the curriculum. The principal ingredient of all learning and teaching is language. Not only is it the tool with which we communicate the lesson, it is also the product the student hands back to us, whether it is the language of math or science or history. In that light, the classroom teacher who reads aloud helps the class to become better listeners and develop greater verbal skills. The more they hear other people's words, the greater becomes their desire to share their own through conversations and writing. Each read aloud, then, is a language art lesson, bolstering the 4 language arts: the art of reading, the art of listening, the art of writing, and the art of speaking. Now, full disclosure, I have read this book before. This is not the first time that I'm hearing this information, but this is the first time that it's clicked in my mind that just the necessity of reading and how vital it is to read aloud. In podcast episode of Read Aloud Revival number 130, Sarah Mackenzie, she interviews Megan Gurdon, and Megan talks about dialogic reading. And she explains what dialogic reading is. She talks about dialogic reading is simply having a dialogue with your child, dialogue with the book, dialogue with the pictures in the book. Megan Gurdon goes on to say in this interview that dialogic reading is a great way as a parent to practice conversation with your child and also to elicit conversation from them and help them to use the words that you're hoping that they're learning in the process of becoming a civilized human being. And then she talks about this dialogic reading, and it's what I naturally do whenever I read a picture book with my kids. And I'm sure it's something that you are naturally doing already. Until a week ago, I did not even know that there was a scientific term for this. However, there is. Dialogic reading is basically just interacting with the pictures, the book, and the child as you're reading the story. So instead of just reading the words on the page, gobble, slurp, chomp, crunch, 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 Ben Bunny and his friends were eating lunch, then you also talk about it with your child. What do you like to eat for lunch? Or what did you just eat for lunch? You talk about the pictures. Okay, look, what are they having for their lunch? It looks like they're having steak and mashed potatoes. There's some peas and some corn. Interacting with the pictures and interacting with the book and interacting with the child. It just naturally happens if you're taking the time to invest and investigate the story with your child. It just naturally happens. It treats the book more as a plaything than just a storybook. So Sarah Mackenzie writes in her book, The Read Aloud Family, she writes, Trelease's book is chock full of statistics and data to prove reading aloud connects and bonds families and helps kids grow to be successful in just about every area of life, especially in school. So that is her take and her encouragement for you to read the Read Aloud Handbook by Jim Trelease. So the fourth benefit of reading aloud to your child is that it nurtures empathy and compassion. And I wanted to read for you what Sarah Mackenzie writes in her book, The Read Aloud Family. She writes, vicarious reading isn't so vicarious. Stories, it turns out, are incredible empathy builders. The process of entering into a life different from our own compels us to see the world from another point of view. This isn't just theory. Keith Oatley, a cognitive psychologist at the University of Toronto, helped conduct a study which showed that reading fictional stories increases the reader's empathetic response to people in their real life. In fact, researchers at Carnegie Mellon University found that reading a story gives the brain similar network connections as actually living through an experience yourself. That is wild. That the brain almost perceives the experiences that you're reading about as something that you've experienced yourself. And that's wonderful. In fact, in Greta Eskridge, Adventuring Together, the last chapter of her book, maybe not the last chapter, it's right before the conclusion, so it is almost the last chapter. In chapter 12, she talks about adventuring with books. Books make adventure accessible. And it's so true and wonderful. So the fifth benefit of reading aloud to your child is that it builds strong connections between the reader and the listener. So it creates this bond. In The Enchanted Hour, Megan Gurdon writes, the time we spend reading aloud is like no other time. A miraculous alchemy takes place when one person reads to another, one that converts the ordinary stuff of life, a book, a voice, a place to sit, and a bit of time, into astonishing fuel for the heart, the mind, and the imagination. She also writes, the evidence has become so overwhelming that social scientists now consider read aloud time one of the most important indicators of a child's prospects in life. That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. So in conclusion, I just wanted to share that I have always thought that reading aloud is important, and I have always sought to really include it as part of our homeschool. In fact, if you were here and you saw my video at the beginning of this year, that was one of my goals, was to read aloud with my kids every single day. And yet, I had no idea how profoundly important reading aloud is. And I've never been this convinced that I must change the way that I view read alouds. And I am determined to make reading aloud with my children, not just my 3-year-old who I will gather onto my lap and snuggle and look at lots of picture books and have lots of dialogic reading with him, but all of my children. I am committed to spending lots and lots of time reading aloud to them. I'd love for you to leave me a comment and let me know, what does read aloud look like in your home and in your homeschool? Is this something that you just kind of view as important, or something that you view as a priority in your homeschool? Thank you so much for listening today and watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week homeschooling. I will see you again in next week's video.